This is the InnovaBuzz podcast, helping smart businesses be even more innovative.
Hi, I'm Jürgen Strauss from InnovaBuzz. Welcome to episode number 99 of the InnovaBuzz podcast, designed to help smart businesses committed to innovation, service, and modern marketing become even more innovative. In this episode, it's my great privilege to speak with Anthony Howard, founder of the Confedere Group, who exist to build a better world by building better leaders. Anthony is a mentor and a coach for CEOs in large public companies across 4 continents. He's also the author of the book Humanise, Why Human-Centered Leadership is Key to the 21st Century, and he's a sought-after speaker. I talked with Anthony about the challenges that organisations face with leadership, and particularly how they often don't have a leadership strategy, which results in leadership being a random agglomeration of people's personal views of leadership, and that usually ends up being a disaster. This is a fascinating and informative interview where Anthony outlines what human-centered leadership involves and why it is key to success in the 21st century. Without further ado then, let's fly into the hive and get the buzz from Anthony Howard. Hi, I'm Jürgen Strauss from InnovaBuzz, and I'm really excited to have as my guest today on the InnovaBuzz podcast, Anthony Howard, the founder of the Confidere Group. Anthony's a mentor and a coach for leaders, most of those leaders being CEOs in large public companies and all the way around the world in 4 continents. He's the author of the book Humanise, Why Human-Centered Leadership is Key to the 21st Century, and he's a sought-after speaker. So I'm really looking forward to speaking with Anthony today about all things leadership. So welcome to the podcast, Anthony.
Thank you, Jürgen, and looking forward to talking to you and your listeners.
Now, Christy Faulkner of Womankind suggested that we interview Anthony, so a big hello to Christy. Hope you're listening.
Hi, Christy.
Now, Anthony, I've had a look through a lot of the things that you've published, not all of them because you're a very prolific publisher, and I've had a glance at your book. I haven't had time to read it all, but that is on the list to read. Leadership is something that I'm very passionate about, and I love your take on it. But before we get on to leadership and leaders and all those kind of things, how did you arrive at what you do today? I mean, why do you do what you do?
The kind of short version is I grew up in a really lovely family in a rural town in Australia, and within a week of finishing school, I was in Japan on a ship, and I joined the merchant navy, what some countries would call the merchant marine, to become a navigator. And so literally overnight, I shifted from, let's say, a warm, caring, loving family to a brutal, violent world of men, where you got stuff done basically by fear and intimidation. Yeah. Now, there were some good men there, and so, but it was a pretty scary place for a 17-year-old who yesterday had been at home and today was in a very different kind of world. And it was a kind of an introduction to a way of leadership that got stuff done there, you know, heavily command and control and intimidation. And I kind of looked at that and said, this is not the way to do it. There must be a better way. Now, I don't want to kind of suggest at 17 I had that level of insight, but when I look back on the work and interest in leadership, I can see it stemming back to that time.
Yeah, so it definitely shaped and set a journey and direction, I guess. And I imagine that was a big culture shock for you.
Absolutely. It was a radical culture shock. So, you know, as listeners could tell from my accent, I'm Australian. But I found myself in a world of 37 men. It was all men. And I was probably one of 2 or 3 Australians. It was like the United Nations. And it was the low bar of humanity. Not, you know, great people, but I was never going to take them home to meet my mother. So it's a quite radical culture shock. And so there was organisational structure, obviously, in terms of, you know, what your job is. But I had to learn that I could not get stuff done by telling people what to do. They would, frankly, give me the finger and ignore me. And I could only get stuff done by figuring out how to lead by influence, figuring out how to build relationships with people so that they would kind of at least give me some level of respect that would enable us to do what needed to be done.
Yeah, that's a great story, and leading by influence is, I guess, that's core to your entire leadership philosophy. And it's interesting that a lot of people do this but don't recognise that they're doing it, and in not recognise that they're actually leading by influence, they don't know when they can actually use it as a tool and apply it.
That's a good observation. It does surprise me that we're not well trained in leadership, if I could make a generalisation. I've interviewed, in the last dozen or more years, 150, 200 plus kind of leaders from a very wide range of environments: academic, military, political sphere, business sphere, social sector. And I've got to be honest, there's the military and some particular segments of the military train leaders well, because they recognise that you as a leader, you're going to be leading a group of men and women into, very difficult situations, and leadership is going to matter at that point. In business, we make an assumption that, if you've got a degree, you've probably got a level of intelligence, and if we give you this job and you've been successful in it, we might get you to lead a team. And suddenly we find ourselves leading people and having to get stuff done through people. Now, certainly there's some businesses who do train and develop their people and do it well. But if you look at leadership as a specific domain, if you like, the level of training is not that good, and we make it up therefore as we go along.
That's right, yeah. I mean, I remember very early in my corporate career where I did really well in the job I was hired. I was hired to do something that I'd been trained for, which was essentially, exercise my knowledge as a chemist, and did quite well at that. And it was exactly the way you said. They said, "Oh, you've done really well in that, so we're going to promote you. We're going to promote you to be in charge of a number of people." And then, of course, I was the youngest in the department, so I was given the two most difficult people to manage. So it was kind of a poison chalice reward. And, so I struggled. But, part of the reason I struggled wasn't just because they were the most difficult people. I mean, they were given to me because nobody else wanted them. But part of the reason I struggled was I had no experience in leading people. I was given no extra tools. I was basically expected to know it because I was good at what I'd done before, which had nothing to do with leadership. So it was kind of a baptism by fire there as well. And actually one of those people turned out to be an absolute gem. And it was, when I realised that it was about building a relationship with the people and then, as you said, leading by influence. And that was when the turnaround came. And I was thinking then, and I'd had lots of discussion. This is going back 30 years, by the way, just giving away my age a bit.
You're a boy.
Lots of discussions in those days around, hey, people come into a job, they do well, they get promoted into a leadership role, and why isn't there anything around where people are actually trained as leaders and given skills so that when they get into a leadership role that they're actually good at that as well? And so it's still like that today, isn't it?
It really is. And so many people, I think, listening would relate to that experience of having been successful in a task then being put into a leadership position, which might be called a management role, to lead a little team. And it's not unusual to be given the most difficult people because, as you say, nobody else wants them. So let's give them to Mary, And so we throw people in the deep end in a very difficult situation and kind of set them up to fail, which is just staggering because that means ultimately we're damaging Mary, who was, all excited about this promotion, and we're damaging, of course, potentially the people that Mary's looking after.
That's
not
right.
good for anybody. And to kind of extend the thinking, if you like, I go into organisations and as you mentioned, I'll be working with a chief executive and, very senior kind of leader, and I'll ask them about their mission, their vision, their purpose, however they want to kind of articulate that. Where are they going? And of course they can articulate that. And then I'll ask about their business plan, their strategy. They can articulate that. And then I'll say, and what's your leadership strategy? And it kind of gets met with silence. And this quizzical look, and well, how do you mean? I say, well, my assumption is that you're going to get stuff done through people. All that stuff you've just described, you're going to get it done through people. And they go, well, right. And I say, well, that's a leadership issue. You have people leading people to achieve those results and outcomes that you're seeking for. So if you don't have a leadership strategy that you can articulate, I guarantee everybody will default to what their view of leadership is. And you could have 1,000 views of leadership loose in the organisation.
Yeah, and it's like you mentioned earlier, I think, when I was relating my story, where, not only does it potentially hurt the new manager and the employees, but it hurts the company as well, because if everybody's running their own version of leadership, and some of that may be reasonable, some of it may be cobbled together, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, and certainly there's going to be 1,000 different variants, so that when people transfer from one place to another, they're suddenly mixed up again, and it hurts the organisation, because, and I think you said that somewhere in the book or in one of your blog posts, that people impact the bottom line.
Absolutely.
And a lot of businesses forget that. So there's, you talk a lot about human-centred leadership, but at the same time, if you consider a business that is concerned about the bottom line and the business making profit and so on, well, it's people that impact that.
It's absolutely people. It gets done through people, and people will default, in my experience, they will default to a command and control style of leadership when they're under pressure and they're not sure how to act. So when they're under pressure, the job's got to get done. They'll be going, John, Mary, better. You got to get that done by 5. You got to work all night. Whatever you got to do, you got to get it done. They'll get bossy. They'll get demanding. And the research is so clear about the negative impact that has on people, the negative impact that has on engagement, the negative impact that has on customer scores, engagement. And so that has to flow through to negative impact on the bottom line.
That's right. Now, you, I think it might be on the tagline on the Confidere website, you talk about human-centred leadership and the focus on the bit I really kind of want to pick up on here is focusing on creating an environment where people can grow, develop and become their best selves. And we kind of do a lot of work on, marketing structure, but we tend to look first at the whole environment of the company before we go into the marketing and that. And so I'm looking for some parallels there, I guess. Tell us a little bit about how you approach that, building that environment first. I guess that's the foundation, is it? Environment and a culture of leadership? Yeah,
very, very much so. I feel really deeply that the primary role of a leader, and so, in a functional sense, a CEO or, someone who's got responsibility for a group of people in an organisation, their primary role is to create an environment in which people can flourish. So in other words, that what that means is, that your job as a leader is to create a space, an environment where people can come to work and do their best work, be their best selves. And so, you'd like to think that, at the end of the day, those people are as good, if not better than they were when they arrived in the morning. So in other words, they're not kind of burnt out and damaged by work. They're energized, they've learned, they've grown, they've developed. And if you extend that into a career, then, over time, these people at work become their best selves. Now, I know life is not just work. There's other dimensions to life than just work. But it's a major dimension, and we find, we find our dignity in work. We find sometimes who we are. Work is often the place where we, make our contribution to society. And so to say, well, how does that, how do I create an environment? So you're right, that's a cultural kind of question. So does my culture, that organisational culture, does my culture promote and encourage initiative, for argument's sake? Is there a culture of, what in classic philosophy is called subsidiarity? Subsidiarity is a sort of philosophy that says decision-making is made at the level where the decision is impacted. So in other words, the boss and management don't impose things from above. So you're an adult and I trust you to come to work and make the best decisions. And in order for you to make the best decisions, then we as an organisation need to have intense clarity about our purpose. Why do we exist? So, for example, Unilever's purpose is to make sustainable living commonplace. So I'm being a little bit simplistic here, but when when someone goes to work at Unilever, they can kind of look at their job and say, does doing this task that I've got now contribute in some way towards making sustainable living commonplace? So the purpose can provide a guardrail or a guide rail. So when I talk about creating an environment, one of the first things a leader does is create the clarity of direction. This is where we're going. And then it gives kind of boundaries for wherein you can work and say, well, Anthony, your role is this. You're moving the organisation, this part of the organisation in this direction, So for argument's sake, let's say we want to say in order to make sustainable living commonplace, we want to make sure that everywhere we touch humanity, whether it's a customer, a supplier, a community in which we manufacture goods, a community in which we sell goods or whatever, we want to make sure that everywhere we touch humanity, we are not undermining this mission to make sustainable living commonplace. In other words, we're not kind of damaging those environments. So your job, Anthony, is to understand our customer sort of touch. You see where I'm going with this? That once you're clear about purpose, you can start setting the environment in which I can operate. And a good leader, you obviously train and develop their people, but a good leader says, I trust you as an adult to make the right decisions to move the organisation forward towards our purpose in your particular part of the business, in your particular domain.
I really like that. And there are some really great examples of purpose or mission statements that companies have that are not, even some of the big corporate ones that are not just corporate speak, but they actually give people that feeling of, the check and balance right now. So, okay, my role is to answer the phone and provide service when people call in on the hotline or whatever. And so somebody answers and so you can ask that question, does taking this action, so let's say it's a decision around giving a refund if somebody lodges a complaint or those sort of things. So, giving the person the ability to make that decision there without necessarily rules, but the direction and the vision and values and purpose where they have that as the compass to make the decision.
Absolutely. I'm reminded of a CEO that I interviewed who was head of a big construction company in Sydney many years ago when Sydney was competing to win the bid for the 2000 Olympic Games. Mm-hmm. So his company was constructing the Olympic stadiums, Olympic swimming pool, these kind of things. And so he forever, he'd go to the individual workers, the bricklayer, the man laying tiles, the man building the Olympic diving platform, all that kind of thing. And he'd say to them, what's your job? And he'd say, well, I'm a bricklayer, I'm laying the tiles, I'm building the platform. And he said, no, you're helping Sydney win the bid for the Olympic Games. And he said, if you go out to that site now and do things like climb the diving platform or go and kind of look behind corners and things, you'll see a quality of work and a professionalism because people didn't see that they were just laying tiles or bricks. They were trying to win the bid for the Olympic Games. And so the purpose doesn't necessarily have to be, this tremendously noble social cause, but it does have to have an aspiration to it that is far beyond just making money and satisfying shareholders. It has to be a purpose that everyone in the organisation can get out of bed in the morning and go, that's why we're working here. Yeah. We're changing our bit of the world in this organisation.
That's right, yeah. Because I guess everybody fundamentally has a need to be significant in that they've made a difference somewhere.
Well, that links back to my whole sort of thinking around human-centred leadership. As persons, as a human being, I want to make a contribution. You want to make a contribution. Your listeners want to make a contribution. There's something in us, in being human, that says there's a bit of the universe, there's a bit of the tapestry that's mine to weave. there's a bit of the painting that's mine to paint, and I want to find out what that is, and I want to do that to the best of my ability. Now, whether people are in the situation where they can do that or not is needs to be addressed. But in terms of wanting to do it, most people are aware of that kind of there's something I'm here to do. I want to make a contribution, and if you can find how that your contribution aligns to an organisational contribution, and then the organisation can have a whole lot of aligned people, it creates a pretty fast-moving kind of organisation. And those are leadership questions, understanding the human person, understanding each person's aspirations, aligning that with the why of the organisation.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. Now, I had a thought there as you were saying that, in that, often, people need to get a job to earn money, earn a living, and sustain themselves and their families. Mm-hmm. And so often people end up in jobs that they're not a good fit for, in terms, maybe they know how to do the work, maybe they have the technical skills, but they're not a good fit for the culture of the organisation. Mm-hmm. And so as a result, at some point, usually fairly quickly, they become unhappy, and it's kind of a bit of a downhill thing there, and they're also not a fit, so that they don't feel that sense of purpose, and maybe they're at odds, the purpose is at odds with their beliefs or whatever. So to me, that kind of comes back to the organisation itself doing the hiring and having a poor hiring plan in place, because they're not doing anyone any favour either by hiring people that aren't a good fit to their culture, their belief system and their environment. So have you got any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think I am of the view that, if you've done an organisation, if an organisation has done good work on its culture, then my expectation is that you've got a good, positive human culture. It's not going to be a negative, lying, backbiting. There are cultures like that, but that's not a culture that's been kind of, worked on and developed. So in other words, unless you're in a toxic kind of culture, and my view would be if you can't change that kind of culture, you should look to leave, that you're probably in a good kind of culture. Now, to your question about, well, what if you're even in a kind of reasonable culture, but you are not a good fit for that culture? Or perhaps, take the other example, you're in a toxic culture and you need to move. And sometimes you can be kind of trapped because you're thinking, well, I've got to pay my mortgage. I've got to kind of care for my family, and I can't just sort of up and leave next week and just hope that the universe will deliver something. Mm. And that's real. That's real for many, 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 many people, and many people are in very difficult situations. The answer, and I offer this knowing that it's kind of not necessarily easy to do and it can take time, but the big picture answer is, first of all, for me to be clear about my purpose. What am I here to do on this planet? And then to say, okay, now what do I need to do to over time move towards that? And so, one's purpose could be to, let's say I discover that my purpose is, or you discover your purpose is to help other people become their best selves. And then you go, and this job I'm doing now does not contribute to that in any way at all. In fact, it's kind of making me be my worst self. Mm-hmm. So then you say, okay, so how do I start to transform myself and my attitude today in this organisation and take this as a learning opportunity to develop at least some skills towards helping others be their best selves? Because if I end up helping others be their best selves, I'm going to find people who are in situations just like me now. So suddenly I can start thinking differently about my work, the work I'm doing in a difficult environment, and I can actually start to get energized by it because I've now transformed the way I think about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that the way our perception towards things really, really matters. Now, I don't want to kind of then leave people with the impression that, we can make it all roses by thinking about it. There are some very difficult kind of situations. But the moment you change the way you think, you will launch a new trajectory. And that will start to create opportunities that you're unaware of at this time.
That's great advice. And clearly It's a lot easier to change the way you think about a situation than to change the situation if it's a big organisation and you're one person in the cog. One cog in the machine.
Absolutely. I find it comical. All these organisations that are running big change programs, we're going to change everyone. But the reality is I struggle enough to change myself, let alone to change someone else. We actually cannot change anybody. It's an illusion. All we can do is create an environment that allows you to change.
Yeah.
That's kind of why the environment really matters.
Yeah, yeah. That's great advice. And I'm interested because there's a lot of companies, and I've come across many that I've worked with, where they're looking at change programs. They've got situations where, because technology is changing and because there's disruptive technology out there. So, if you think about photography or the hotel industry with Airbnb or the taxi industry with Uber, where, the traditional business models are kind of disappearing because people aren't responding or adapting to them or not ahead of the game. So there's companies that are aware of this and saying, well, what's the next disruptive technology that might impact on us? And of course, they don't know the answer. But what they do know is that we need to make sure we're ahead of this game. And many of them say that one way to stay ahead of this game is to really work on developing our people, building that culture of people first, but then, giving people the freedom to be innovative, the freedom to keep learning, the freedom to actually make mistakes within a limited kind of framework so that they learn and push the boundaries. And and that does involve, in many cases, a change program. So what's your recommendation to those kind of companies to go about implementing that sort of change?
Can I just kind of dial back to your opening comments in your comments there? You were talking about, you mentioned, and this is true, that many organisations are looking out and saying, where's the next disruption? What do we, can we get ahead of the curve on that, for example? I think the primary question that you need to ask before that, one that really matters, is, what is the trend that our business is built on, and what will happen if that changes? So for example, in Australia, there's been 25 years or plus of mandated money going into superannuation funds, or what in other countries might be called pension funds. Personal pension funds, where an amount of my income each week goes into an allocated fund for my retirement. And so that's mandated by the government. And of course, an industry has sprung up to manage and invest those funds.
Yeah.
What would happen if the government, because of government financial requirements, A, B, and because the government said, actually, you could just put all the money in an index tracker. I'm being simplistic here. So therefore, you actually don't need all this money making a whole lot of money off people's superannuation. And so why don't we, the government, legislate to have all these funds controlled by the government? So that business, those businesses are built on that investment trend. The business would stop overnight.
Yeah.
So I'm not suggesting that's going to happen, but that to me is a very good example of, we make an assumption about the trend our business built on is going to continue.
Yeah.
And so while the superannuation fund might be looking, for example, at robo-advice or, artificial intelligence and how that can kind of serve the customer, great questions. But the more fundamental question always has to be, what is the trend our business is built on, and what will happen if that changes? The moment you start asking that question, you might find a way of actually becoming the change agent and saying, we could actually disrupt the trend itself, rather than looking at down the track saying what trend what technology might disrupt us. Not sure I answered your question, but that was what was triggered by your comments.
No, that's great advice, because you've turned it around so that you're asking the question that may get you out in front of the game, which is essentially where you want to be, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I guess what I was thinking was if somebody is in a position where, okay, we've got to make some changes now that involves, some fundamental change in the way our people are, and it's around leadership development in many ways. And so how do you go about bringing that change about? Because like you said earlier, it's, you can only really change yourself. You can't change anybody else.
Yes, and so absolutely, this kind of change would start from the top. So if I kind of say, okay, so the leader's responsibility is to create an environment in which people can flourish. So their first wave, if you like, has to be that they've done that with their own executive team and shown them how to do it, and then it progressively cascades through the organisation. Now, I know sometimes with a very big organisation and even smaller ones, you actually need a change program that says, okay, we're implementing this technology, we're going to teach people how it works, we're going to change the way we work, our systems and processes, and we have a change program to do that, and that will drive the need for new kinds of behaviours, and we might teach people, how to behave in new kind of ways, for example, new listening skills or, whatever it might be. I kind of see those as, for want of a better word, not accurate, but for want of a better word, machine level. These are kind of tactical things that have got to get done. But the bigger question at a leadership and a human level is how do we lead people through these kind of changes? So even if we're a wonderful organisation and we accept that people who will change at their own pace and so forth, then I've really got to say to start with my leadership team, how do I help them grow and develop and become the best person that they can be? And this comes back to my earlier observation about leadership strategy. We might say in the current environment, given everything that's going on, given the kind of program or the agenda that we've got, the kind of leaders that we need more than anything else will be servant leaders. Leaders who will see their primary responsibility and their primary function is to serve those under them. And then we'll cascade that. So we're going to train people as servant leaders. We're going to help them understand what service is. We're going to help them understand, how to understand other people. We're going to help them understand how to put others first in order to get the outcomes that they require. We might say, no, we need strategic leaders. We need leaders with a very high level of strategic thinking. So we're going to do a lot of work around critical thinking. We're going to do a lot of work around critical analysis, strategic mindsets, global insight, agility, those kind of things. So the leadership strategy, if you like, does flow from, what the organisation is trying to achieve at this time with its people. Whichever leadership strategy or approach you adopt, I think the starting point is always, however, it involves people. It's me leading Mary. It's Mary leading John. It's human persons, and so we need to ensure that we have people who see that serving this person is the first responsibility of leadership, whatever kind of strategy we have around the leadership approach.
Yeah, great advice. Now, one of the things that I'm curious about in terms of kind of putting people into age categories, I guess, and I hear this from time to time, is how do you engage millennials in a leadership program like that, or how do you gain the loyalty of millennials, because people kind of paint them or with a broad brush and say millennials because of the opportunity and because of the way they've grown up. I guess they're much more inclined to jump from one job to another, and yet clearly, if an organisation has got an ageing workforce, they've got to get some new ideas and new thoughts and people who understand modern technology in there, so which are millennials. So what are your thoughts on that?
I may not be the best person to ask because,
because neither of us are.
I'm a long way from being a millennial, I can tell you, but I have millennial children and I have millennials on my team.
Yeah.
So my First observation is I'm kind of not a believer in this stratification, you know, X, Y, millennial, you know, all this kind of thing. I understand how, you know, different generations think differently, but I think it's a bit simplistic to put them into those kind of what I would think of marketing kind of categories, because I think most people are human beings.
Yeah.
You know, they want to make a contribution. And so, you know, when I read some of the definitions of Gen X or Y or millennials or whatever, I think actually I kind of identify with a lot of those sort of traits. You know, I need to be kept engaged. I got this level of curiosity that, you know, if I keep me engaged, I'll wander off to something else. So there's a whole lot.
I get the same thing when I'm reading some of that stuff. And I mean, I agree with you. I don't, you know, I think there's a danger in actually categorizing things like that. And I think, you know, you're still talking about people and everybody's got their individual characteristics. And yes, I mean, you can say that, well, people that have grown up in, you know, after the 1980s perhaps have grown up with technology and so on. But, you know, they're still people, like you say.
They are, you know, and there's undoubtedly differences, you know. Generations that have grown up connected to devices are different to, you know, the straddle generation of the before and after. And, you know, so there's clearly different levels of comfort with technology or whatever, but I think we have to be really careful to, you know, to kind of categorize people and just forget actually, you know, look at, you know, I've met military leaders in their 20s who, you know, I look at and go, gee, I would follow you into battle.
Yeah.
You know, because they've been trained and developed as leaders.
That's right, yeah. And by the same token, I've met entrepreneurs that have gone out and done some stuff themselves and, you know, in their early 20s, and wow, yeah, impressive. And
that's right. And I've met entrepreneurs in their 50s who think, wow, there's just no stopping these folks.
Yeah, that's right. Either way. So it's not really anything to do with age. I guess it comes back to, because what, you know, like you said earlier, you know, taking it up another level and digging deeper and asking the more fundamental question, and maybe that's the same here, ask the more fundamental question, which to my mind is, how do you keep these people engaged? How do you keep them, you know, how do you provide them an environment to become their best selves? And maybe one thing about younger people, whether that's, you know, a generational thing or whether it's just an age thing, is they're perhaps less patient about that environment, getting into that environment. And if there's more opportunities around, perhaps there are more opportunities around today to go somewhere else and explore that, and maybe they're more willing to do that. That's the only thing that I'd
possibly. That's you're probably right there. Another observation I would add to that is there's no doubt at this moment in history in the West, I think there's a little bit of a luxury of the West, but there's no doubt that we are in a moment where there's a big kind of social search for meaning and purpose at an individual level, at an organizational level, at national levels. You know, we're saying, why do we really exist? You know, what's sort of my point of contribution? And so, for example, there's any number of consultancy practices today that help organizations find their purpose that did not exist 5 years ago.
Yeah.
There's, you know, the number of people who, you know, Simon Sinek and others start with why. That kind of really, really matters. Now, I don't think that's a millennial thing. I think that's a social thing that is just happening at this moment in history.
Yeah.
But it would be true, I think largely the case, that if you as an organisation can't articulate a clear purpose and you keep saying that, you know, your purpose is to make money and I've got this fiduciary responsibility to make money for shareholders, that's not really going to hold people going forward. I think the difference between broadly an older and a younger generation is a younger generation is looking at more, you know, 20, 30, 40 years of work life. So I'm more inclined to say, I'm just not going to spend my life doing this kind of thing. I will up and move. Whereas if maybe you're near at the end of your career, you could look at it and go, you know, this is not overly stimulating, but I'm kind of nearing the end.
Yeah.
So I think there's those kind of gradations on the continuum. So, yeah, my overall point is purpose and meaning really matters at work now in a way that it didn't 5 or 10 years ago.
Mm. On the other hand, though, with that gradation in age and so on, and I'd slipped my mind where I read this recently, but it was pointing out that, there's a lot of older people in the workforce and older people that have left the workforce that have an enormous amount of experience and skills and experience that they've developed over their working life. And then there's a whole generation of people coming in at the other end that might have learnt a lot at school or university, but haven't developed the practical skills that these folk have, and there's no way of connecting that. And I guess that's a leadership question as well, and how do you lead that? And the people who wrote this were talking about a program to bring older people and maybe even people that had retired back into the workforce to essentially be mentors for the young folk. And I thought that was a really neat model as well.
Yes, there's a number of consulting firms, search firms, these kind of strategy firms who are doing that, where, whereas the partner might have retired, in the past at 60, for argument's sake, now they're having this kind of transition period where you cease being a, if you like, an equity partner of the firm, but you continue as a contributing kind of partner, and your role very much is to be that sounding board, that wise counsel for, new people coming through. I remember talking to, a very well-known CEO a few years ago, and he recalled having a group of senior leaders, in effect the retired folks, who formed what they called a wise elders council. And so, as a young person in the firm, if you were facing something, how do I kind of work my way through this? You could call these people and say, look, I'd just like to sit down with 2 or 3 of you or one of you and kind of rattle around this idea that I'm thinking about. And I think that's a wonderful model for tapping into the wisdom of age.
Yeah. And it kind of sets a bit of that environment of the leadership, and, to allow someone to explore their ideas in a way that isn't is safe, if you like, from the point of view of hopefully people will come back and give some constructive feedback, even if it may be negative, but constructive.
Indeed. And it sends a message that says we don't expect you to have all the answers.
Yeah.
We don't expect you to know everything. What we do expect is a level of curiosity. What we do expect is you to want to search things out and to grow and develop. And we're creating an environment, and that's one example of it, that will enable you to do that. Here's one methodology, one approach to your own growth, learning and development.
All right. Now, you talk quite a lot about human-centred leadership, and I know you've kind of got 5 points that I've heard you talk about before. So do you want to just give us a very short summary of those 5 points for people to be aware of if they're interested in pursuing human-centred leadership or making some change or whatever it might be?
Yes, I don't know if these are necessarily the 5 points as such, but contextually, what I've been concerned about is that we're moving into a time in history where, if you like, the human person is being sidelined. So we're seeing the rise of artificial intelligence and the rise of technology, that, technology, we're in this always-on kind of world, and these wonderful kind of labour-saving devices that were meant to, free up our time. They've almost created this bondage, we're wired into this thing all the time. And so things that were meant to connect us are kind of disconnecting us. Things that were meant to connect us are fragmenting us. And so that's happening at the same time as this rise of artificial intelligence, which is kind of getting smarter than us rapidly. And so even though I'm not necessarily a believer in the Terminator scenario, my concern is that technology is ramping up faster than our humanity. And that's happening at the same time as the traditional moral carriers, if you like, the moral authorities, the churches, governments, business, have seriously fallen out of favour. We have lost trust in those traditional institutions. So what does it mean to be human in the 21st century in the face of these sort of challenges? And I just feel so deeply that the number one challenge confronting leaders is to build human-centred organisations in the face of these major trends that are going the other way and depersonalising the culture. I'm not sure if that's the question you were asking, but that was sort of what came to mind.
Yeah, no, that's great, a great snapshot. And I think you're right. I mean, I'm always fascinated by the, people sit in the cafe. In fact, I was with somebody last weekend. We were sharing an apartment, and we were sitting across the table working on our laptops. So we were each doing our own thing. But then the other person said to me, "I'll just send you this email." And I said, "Or you could tell me."
Yeah.
Because I'm sitting across the table. Yeah.
Like in the olden days.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I think at the same time we do take that a little bit with a grain of salt, because, I certainly remember in the pre-internet days, if you were riding on a train, everyone would have their head in a newspaper. So
or a book.
It wasn't like we were in this wonderful communicative kind of age, but things have changed with technology.
Yeah.
We are, as you say, more inclined to send an email rather than pick up a phone and make a call, rather than go and have a coffee, and so it's a trend that kind of really does worry me.
That's right. And then if you take that trend further, so I'm a big fan of social media, but I think it has its place and it needs to be used carefully. And in the digital marketing world, where we operate, I keep explaining to people it's actually no different than anywhere else, where number one, you have to build a relationship with people first. You have to then understand, what they need, and is their biggest need something that you can help with. And then if, you build a relationship and those two things match up as well, then maybe you can do business with them. And technology just enables you to remove some geographic boundaries to that equation. But it's still around building a relationship with people. So if you're on Facebook or if you're on LinkedIn or something, and you say, okay, I can do some marketing through that, or I can reach people through that, it is still about building a relationship. And, that's the human part of it.
Absolutely. It's absolutely, because it's, human to human.
Yeah.
If you're selling something or whatever, there's a human person at some point who's considering buying that, or there's a human person with a need that you're trying to uncover to find out whether there's sufficient people with that need to, create a business out of that. Most businesses that were created because someone identified a human need and said, I think I can create something to solve that need for those people.
Yeah, and quite often, the most powerful ones, and I had a personal example of this over the weekend, the most powerful ones are where you recognise a need for yourself and you create something to address that need, and then how
that's true too,
and know how it works, and the power of it. And then if you hear somebody else say, "Oh, gee, I wish there was a way of dealing with this particular issue," and so, well, actually, I've got a way, and then all of a sudden there is that connection because you've matched up the need and the solution. But you still have to build a relationship there before you really get any further.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, this is a fascinating discussion, Anthony. I could sort of explore this a whole lot more, and I'm sure you're passionate about it.
A number of angles, yeah.
Could talk some more as well, but I'm mindful of your time and the listeners' time. So I'd like to move on to the Buzz, which is our innovation round, and that's designed to help our audience. And they're primarily innovators and leaders in their field, with some tips from your experience. So I've got 5 questions, and hopefully you'll give us some really insightful answers that'll inspire people to do something awesome. So,
well, hopefully. I don't know necessarily whether I'm an innovator, but let's go and see what we'll...
Yeah, well, what's the number one thing anyone needs to do to be more innovative is the first question.
They need to get out of their world, out of their industry, their country, their community, go and talk to people in very different places, because someone somewhere is doing something that'll change your world tomorrow. So, get out of your world, get out and see the future.
Great advice. And it's interesting, my last guest that I interviewed said something very similar. her response was travel, but basically using the same reasoning. So great.
Right.
What's the best thing you've done to develop new ideas?
I've actually done that. I heard that advice back in 2004, and I've literally spent hundreds of thousands of dollars. I've spent 3, 4, 5 weeks every year going out and talking to very different people.
All right, great. And that's exciting. So for all those people that love to travel, there's a reason, a business reason.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What's your favourite tool or system for allowing you to be more innovative?
It's a combination of the grey matter and the conversation. It seriously is. But if I could just expand on it slightly. So it's having the conversation, but it's also kind of then sitting down and saying, well, where are the kind of gaps? He's saying this, she's saying that. What's not being said? So it's applying kind of rigorous thought and reflection to what I'm hearing, and then trying to apply that to some challenges or problems that I'm observing, and doing that in a playful way. Why was that plane late? Why was that train late? What's going on here? Why does coffee cost this much money in Norway? It kind of doesn't matter what the question is, but in the play, things will emerge.
Yeah, that's great advice. And you said something earlier about curiosity, and that's definitely curious, right?
So absolutely.
Going across different things that may or may not be related, but being really curious, asking questions and reflecting on why things are the way they are. Great. So what's the best way to keep a client on track?
I think having some kind of check-in process. So the idea of, we'll do X by Friday or we'll do X this year, for me in my world doesn't work. I know there's some that have those kind of deadline things. But it's kind of like, okay, what's our expectation for this phase, for this kind of project, and then having regular kind of check-ins against that. How are we going against that? And so if they're a client of mine that's in a sense paying me money to help them with that, then I'll take some level of responsibility for that. But so my short answer is intense clarity about what we mean when we say we're going to do this at this time. What does that really, really mean?
Yeah, great advice. So getting really clear of the outcome and then just keeping track of it by regularly checking in. All right. Now, what's the number one thing anyone can do to differentiate themselves?
I think to ask their clients how they differentiate them.
Mm-hmm.
Why does someone use you, Anthony? Why does someone use you? So to ring my clients, to ring your clients and say, you could have chosen anybody, but you chose me. Why? It's actually quite surprising when they say, well, it's this and it's that.
Yeah.
So one of the things that emerged for me a few years ago was this research that I do around the world. So many clients said, that sets you apart. Oh. So find out how others differentiate you.
That's great advice. And you're right. You learn something from that. And I've done that a little bit. And when I first did it, it was almost by accident, or maybe even the client imposed the answer on me. I didn't ask the question, but they told me something that I thought, well, yeah, I do that. No, I never did it. It was around not speaking technical language and making things really simple to understand. And it was something, yeah, that's right, that's important to me, but it wasn't something I did consciously. It was just unconscious.
Right.
Clients really value it.
Actually, and if I could pick up on that, the things that we do really well, or we kind of take for granted about ourselves, we take it so much for granted that we think it's really common.
Yeah.
But others look at it and go, that's really rare.
Yeah.
And finding that out, we go, actually, that's what sets me apart.
Yeah, great advice. All right, so what's the future for you then, Anthony, and for the Confidere Group? I guess, there's a need for leadership going forward, as we've discussed, so I'm sure there's lots of need for your services.
Yeah, we're so in kind of simple terms, traditionally we were let's say a CEO mentoring, CEO coaching kind of practice. We're much more a leadership practice now, working with individuals, working with groups. So it's really helping organisations figure out their leadership strategy, develop leaders to implement that strategy, and then supporting them at either an individual or an organisational, particularly executive level, to make the kind of transitions and deliver the kind of leadership impact they want.
All right. I'll look forward to keeping in touch and seeing how things go from here. So what's the number one piece of advice you'd give to any business owner who wants to be a leader in innovation and in their field?
I'd have to go back to my other piece of advice. Get out and see the future. Get out of your existing kind of world. We're all restricted by our thinking, by our current environment. And so the moment you get out of that, you go, oh, there's another way of addressing exactly the same problem. There's another way of asking a question. And so finding a better question will be much more effective than finding a better answer. Yeah.
And I had a recent example of this, and I won't go into detail because I'm not sure how much of it is public information, but basically somebody described a situation or a proposal that they were putting together for what is a fairly complicated problem. And this proposal is now going to the people that have to, that control the purse strings. And when I heard about it, I said, oh, that's a really neat solution. And they said, well, it's something that we've seen in Germany and in Switzerland and in France.
Right.
So this is an Australian company. So it's exactly what you're saying there. So they've gone around and seen things in action, how they could be with the blinkers off outside of their environment and outside of the limitations and restrictions to their thinking that were in place.
Absolutely. If you're a bank, don't go and look at another bank.
Yeah.
Go and look at a retailer. Go and look at a manufacturer. Just get right out of your world. Yeah.
That's right. And I'm sure that's how somebody like Uber or Airbnb come up with their ideas. It's definitely not looking at the hotel industry.
Yeah. They're looking at people and saying, there's a problem here. I can solve it in this new and innovative way.
Yeah. Fantastic. All right. Thanks, Anthony. This has been really great. Where can people reach out to you and say thanks for what you shared today?
Thank you, Jürgen. So the Confidere Group website is probably the best place. So that's Confidere, CONFIDERE group.com.
All right. And we'll have a link to that in the show notes of the blog post as well. And finally, then, who would you like me to interview on a future InnovaBuzz podcast and why?
Oh, there could be hundreds there, couldn't there? But
there could be, yeah.
I guess a couple that come to mind, one I'm thinking of is a young woman called Stephanie Lorenzo, who, Stephanie can tell her own story, but did some amazing work setting up an organisation called Project Futures to engage young people in helping to bring an end to modern day slavery. Just a completely innovative business she launched out of nothing. Wonderful. Stephanie you'd have a lot of fun talking to Stephanie. All
right. Well, Stephanie, if you're listening to this, and maybe you will be by the time we publish it, look out for an invitation from us to the InnovaBuzz podcast, courtesy of Anthony Howard. All right. Well, thanks so much, Anthony, for sharing your insights with us today on the InnovaBuzz podcast. I've really enjoyed this discussion. It's been fun. I've learned a lot, and I wish you for the future all the best for the Confidere Group, for your own work, and, make a difference to developing leaders. I think that's a really important thing to do in the world.
Thank you. It's been a delight.
Thanks. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Anthony as much as I enjoyed this interview. There's so much valuable advice which Anthony shares on leadership, on innovation in this interview. He's spoken to hundreds of CEOs around the world, interviewed a lot of knowledgeable people, and he brings that information to us today and shares that with us here. Now, all those ideas and tips that Anthony spoke about can be found at innovabiz.com.au/Anthony Howard. That is ANTHONYHOWARD. All lowercase, all one word, innovabiz.com.au/Anthony Howard. You'll also find contact information for getting in touch with Anthony there, as well as information on his book about human-centered leadership. Now, we'd love to hear about your biggest takeaway from this episode. Please leave comments in the comments section of the blog post and also tell us about your leadership strategy. And I hope that you have one, and I hope that you can share that with us so that we can all learn from your experience. Anthony suggested that I interview Stephanie Lorenzo of Project Futures on a future InnovaBuzz podcast. So Stephanie, keep an eye on your inbox for an invitation from us to the InnovaBuzz podcast, courtesy of Anthony Howard. To my listeners, if you haven't already done so, head on over to iTunes or Stitcher or Pocket Casts or whatever you use to listen to podcasts and subscribe to the InnovaBuzz podcast so you'll never miss a future episode. Now, for those of you that still haven't left a review, then please tell us what you think. Give us some feedback. We love feedback and reviews because it helps to let us know how we're doing. If there's anything you'd like us to cover, topics you want us to deal with, questions you want answered on a future InnovaBuzz podcast, or indeed guests you'd like us to interview, then please send those ideas to us. Until next time, I'm Jürgen Strauss from InnovaBuzz. Remember to be awesome and keep innovating.